There are moments in politics when power doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers, it leans, it applies pressure just enough to test whether the system bends or breaks. This is one of those moments. A criminal investigation, a central bank, a president who wants lower interest rates faster. On the surface, it looks procedural, technical, almost boring. But beneath it lies something far more dangerous, a direct collision between political will and institutional independence. For years, the Federal Reserve has stood apart from daily politics, not because its leaders are perfect, but because stability demands distance. Now that distance is being challenged not with legislation, but with intimidation. And something unusual is happening. Republicans, long known for marching in lockstep with Donald Trump, are hesitating. Some are uneasy. A few are openly resisting. Not over ideology, not over policy, but over whether the rules of the system still matter. If you care about markets, democracy, or simply the price you pay to borrow money, this story isn't abstract. It's personal. Stay with me. Because what looks like an internal Republican dispute may be the opening chapter of a much larger institutional crisis. And to understand why this moment is so explosive, we have to be precise about what is actually at stake. At its core, this is not a story about a building renovation, marble versus glass, or even whether Jerome Powell misled Congress. Those details matter only because they provide a pretext. The real issue is far more fundamental. Who controls monetary power in the United States when political pressure collides with institutional design? The Federal Reserve was built to be insulated from short-term politics. Interest rates shape inflation, employment, asset prices, and ultimately the daily lives of millions. If those decisions become hostage to electoral timelines or presidential impatience, the consequences don't stay in Washington. They ripple outward fast. What makes this moment different is not that a president is angry with the Fed. That has happened before. What is different is the method, a criminal probe initiated by the executive branch aimed at the chair of an independent central bank. For Republican lawmakers, this creates an uncomfortable dilemma. Loyalty to the president has long been the party's organizing principle. But the Fed's independence has also been a cornerstone of conservative economic thinking for decades. Now, those two commitments are in direct conflict. Some Republicans are trying to look away. Others are voicing concern without action. And a small number are signaling something rare in modern politics, a willingness to block their own president in defense of an institution. That tension between silence, discomfort, and resistance is where this story truly begins to unfold. Because to understand why the stakes feel so high right now, we have to step back and look at how we got here in the first place. To see why this conflict is so charged, we have to understand the long arc of how central banking earned its autonomy and why politicians so often try to reclaim it. The Federal Reserve's independence did not emerge from idealism. It was a hard-learned response to crisis. Repeated cycles of inflation, political interference, and economic instability taught policymakers that short-term political incentives are often incompatible with long-term economic health. Over time, an informal contract emerged. Elected leaders would set the broad goals, the Fed would manage the instruments, distance became the price of credibility. That credibility is why markets react not just to interest rate changes, but to tone, language, and even perceived pressure. Investors don't ask whether a president prefers lower rates. They ask whether the central bank is free to say no. Fast forward to the present. Donald Trump has made no secret of his frustration. Rates have been cut, but not fast enough, not deeply enough. And as Powell's term nears its end, leverage increases. Enter the renovation controversy. A project approved years earlier, cost overruns, testimony to Congress. On paper, it offers a legal pathway. In practice, it aligns perfectly with a political objective: apply pressure without changing the law. For many Republicans, this triggers institutional memory. They recognize the pattern. Once independence erodes, restoring it is extraordinarily difficult. And that realization sets the stage for the first real rupture, because theory becomes reality the moment someone decides to act. The moment this stopped being theoretical came when one Republican senator drew a line. Tom Tillis did not argue that Jerome Powell was innocent or guilty. He did something far more consequential. He questioned the legitimacy of the process itself. For Tillis, the danger wasn't an inaccurate forecast of renovation costs. It was the signal being sent that the Justice Department could be used, or perceived to be used, to pressure an independent institution into compliance. And then he escalated. Tillis announced he would vote against any Federal Reserve nominee until the legal matter was fully resolved. That includes the chairmanship itself, set to open when Powell's term expires in May. This is not symbolic resistance. It is mechanical. The Senate Banking Committee is closely divided. If Tillis joins Democrats in opposition, the committee deadlocks. No nominee advances. No replacement moves forward. Suddenly, a single senator turns unease into leverage. Lisa Murkowski followed, calling the probe an attempt at coercion and warning that the stability of markets depends on independence. In that moment, concern became coordination. If you're still following this closely, pause for a second and engage. These turning points are rare, and they shape what comes next. But this was only the first rupture, because not everyone was willing to go that far. And the contrast between resistance and retreat reveals even more about the system under strain. What this episode exposes is not just political disagreement, but the hidden mechanics of how pressure works in modern governance. There is no executive order stripping the Fed of its independence, no vote to rewrite its mandate. Instead, the mechanism is indirect, deniable, and powerful. A criminal investigation does not need to succeed to be effective. Its mere existence changes incentives. It introduces uncertainty. It forces calculations that have nothing to do with monetary policy and everything to do with personal risk. For a Fed chair, the message is clear. Every decision now carries a shadow. Even if the case collapses, the process itself becomes the punishment. This is why so many Republicans are uneasy but hesitant. They sense the danger, but the system gives them plausible exits. Express concern, defer to process, avoid confrontation, let it play out. And that ambiguity is the point. Some senators criticize Powell as a policymaker while distancing themselves from the investigation. Others insist on institutional independence while refusing to challenge the president directly. Each stance preserves individual safety while slowly normalizing interference. The most revealing detail is what isn't happening. There is no unified defense of the Fed, no collective red line, only fragments of resistance. And in systems like this, fragmentation favors power because pressure doesn't require consensus. It only requires enough silence. But silence, as history shows, has consequences. And those consequences become visible when the conflict moves from institutions to people. As the pressure campaign unfolds, the second rupture appears not through defiance, but through avoidance. Listen carefully to what many Republican lawmakers are saying. They don't defend the investigation. They don't condemn it either. Instead, they retreat into process. I don't know enough. That's not my branch. Let it play out. These statements sound neutral. They are not. Neutrality in moments like this functions as permission. It allows an extraordinary step, the criminal targeting of a sitting Fed chair, to become administratively normal. Even critics of Powell fall into this trap. Some call him a bad Fed chair, while acknowledging he is not a criminal. Others worry aloud that the investigation itself could push interest rates higher, undermining the very goal it is meant to achieve. This is the paradox. The effort to force rates down may do the opposite, because markets are allergic to politicized central banking. Uncertainty raises risk premiums. Risk premiums raise borrowing costs. And yet, the confrontation continues. GOP leadership stays largely silent. They urge patience. They urge restraint. But restraint without boundaries dissolves into passivity. At this stage, the conflict has passed a critical threshold. It is no longer just about Jerome Powell. It is about whether institutional norms survive when they are tested indirectly. Because once fear enters decision-making, independence becomes theoretical. And the real damage begins to show not in Senate hearings, but in everyday life. Now let's shift perspective. Because while senators debate process and presidents apply pressure, the consequences do not stay confined to committee rooms. They reach you. When the independence of the Federal Reserve is questioned, markets react before laws change. Investors demand certainty. When they don't get it, they charge for risk. That cost flows downhill. It shows up in your mortgage rate, in your credit card balance, in the loan a small business hesitates to take. You may never hear Jerome Powell's name again after this cycle, but you will feel the effects if confidence erodes. Central banking works only when people believe decisions are made for economic reasons, not political survival. That belief is fragile, and once it cracks, restoring it is slow and painful. This is why the rare Republican resistance matters. Not because it is dramatic, but because it acknowledges something fundamental. Institutions exist to protect people from volatility created by power struggles at the top. If you're feeling like these fights are abstract, they're not. They shape the price of stability in your life. But this isn't just an American story. Because when the world's most important central bank is pulled into political conflict, the shockwaves travel far beyond US borders. The Federal Reserve is not just a domestic institution. It is a global anchor. When its independence is questioned, foreign governments, central banks, and investors pay attention immediately. The dollar sits at the center of the global financial system. US interest rates shape capital flows, currency values, and debt burdens around the world. Political pressure on the Fed introduces a new variable, one that cannot be modeled easily. Allies begin to hedge. Emerging markets brace for volatility. Even rivals recalibrate their assumptions about US. Institutional reliability. This is why global markets react not only to what the Fed does, but to whether it appears free to do it. A central bank perceived as coerced weakens confidence in the currency it backs. That does not happen overnight. It accumulates slowly at first, then all at once. For decades, American policymakers benefited from a reputation for institutional continuity. That reputation lowered borrowing costs and amplified US influence abroad. Now, this episode puts that advantage at risk. And it arrives at a moment when global stability is already strained, when uncertainty compounds uncertainty. What makes this especially dangerous is that the damage does not require failure. It only requires doubt. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this go from here? Because from this point forward, the path is not singular. It branches. From this moment, three paths begin to diverge. In the first scenario, restraint prevails. The investigation resolves quickly. Republicans who raised concerns hold their ground just long enough to reassert a boundary. The Federal Reserve emerges bruised but intact. Markets stabilize. The lesson is absorbed quietly. Pressure has limits. This is the best outcome. Not because it avoids conflict, but because it reaffirms a principle that institutions can be tested without being captured. The second scenario is murkier. The investigation lingers, nominees stall, the Fed continues to operate, but under a cloud. Decisions are scrutinized not just for economic logic, but for political signaling. Independence remains on paper, but uncertainty becomes routine. In this world, the cost is gradual. Higher risk premiums, persistent volatility, a slow erosion of trust that few can pinpoint, but everyone feels. The third scenario is the most dangerous. Pressure succeeds. The precedent is set. Future Fed leaders internalize the lesson. Resistance carries consequences. Monetary policy bends, not overtly, but subtly. No law changes, no announcement is made. but the system shifts. And once that shift occurs, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. History shows that institutions rarely collapse dramatically. They degrade incrementally until one day they no longer perform the function they were designed to protect. Which brings us to the final question. What does this moment demand from leaders, from lawmakers, and from you? This moment will not be remembered for a renovation project or a line of testimony. It will be remembered for whether boundaries held when they were tested quietly. Power always seeks efficiency. Institutions exist to slow it down. That tension is not a flaw of democracy, it is its safeguard. When the Justice Department, the presidency, and the central bank drift into the same gravitational field, the risk is not chaos, it is control. What makes this episode so revealing is that it does not rely on spectacle. There are no tanks in the streets, no emergency decrees, just pressure, just process, just enough ambiguity to make resistance costly. And yet, even here, choice remains. Some lawmakers chose silence, a few chose discomfort, and a very small number chose to act not because it was easy, but because systems only survive when individuals are willing to defend them. The independence of the Federal Reserve is not an abstract ideal. It is a promise that economic decisions will not be sacrificed for political urgency. If that promise matters to you, this is not a story to watch passively, because the question this moment leaves us with is simple and unsettling. When pressure rises quietly, who decides when to push back? And who decides when it's already too late?